If you spend enough time on social media, you will inevitably come across an echo chamber. Those dark, corrupted corners of society full of critical thinking challenged individuals. And the worst are on social media. Now, in the past, the average person could simply ignore the strange ideologies of these echo chambers. But for the avid consumer of modern entertainment, this stuff has started to spill over into the lives of normal people through mediums such as this new James Bond novel, On His Majesty's Secret Service, written by Charlie Higson. And I was shocked to see what Charlie Higson got away with in this novel. So let's look at this article by Bounding Into Comics. Latest James Bond novel makes it abundantly clear the villains are white men who oppose wokeness. Now, I don't always agree with the opinions of Bounding Into Comics, and I don't think this title is accurate. The villains aren't white men who oppose wokeness, they're straw men of right-wing extremism that you would see from a left-wing echo chamber. So the synopsis is, it is the 4th of May, 2 days before the coronation of King Charles III, and the world's favorite spy has his work cut out for him. It continues, Bond is sent at the last minute to thwart an attempt to disrupt the coronation by the wealthy, eccentric, and self-styled Athelstan of Wessex, who is on a deadly mission of his own to teach the United Kingdom a lesson. Can Bond dismantle his shady plans and defeat his privately hired team of mercenaries? That's the most uninspired synopsis for a James Bond story I've ever heard. While the synopsis does not make it clear who Athelstan of Wessex is, a screenshot of the book from Leo Kearse and brought to Bounding Into Comics' attention by ex-user Kenobi Stig hints at who the villains are. The excerpt shared by Leo Kearse is part of Bond infiltrating Athelstan's organization, and more specifically his Anglo-Saxon castle. In order to do so, he poses as Peter Sanborn, the leader of a group of 30 mercenaries. Kearse's excerpt sees Bond observing a number of guests who have also been invited to Athelstan's castle. It specifically describes a man named Roger Burkett. And so I'm just going to go ahead and read this page here. Burkett was an ex-Tory MP, famous for promoting COVID, vaccines, mask-wearing, 5G conspiracy theories, which had spilled over into the usual anti-immigrant, anti-EU, anti-BBC, anti-MSM, anti-cultural Marxist climate change denial pronouncements. Jesus Christ. If a publisher out there is hiring people to just list things that they don't like, sign me up. I could do that all day. It was an anti-trans diatribe that had eventually got him kicked out of the party, and he soon after set up the New Freedom Party. Bond was struck by something. It was a long while since he'd been at any kind of function that was almost exclusively full of men. It felt strange. There was not even a pretense at diversity here. Athelstan hadn't been the least bit concerned about ensuring that half of the people he'd hired to carry out his coup could be women or non-white or disabled. Yeah, because the most successful coups in history have been perpetrated by disabled. That makes total sense. This was an unapologetically old school gathering. In Athelstan's world, he was king and he could do whatever he wanted. Well, in Charlie Higson's world, he is king and he passes this crap off as a novel. So there are a few things there that I thought were funny. Well, the first thing is, it says it felt strange that he was in a gathering exclusively full of men, but it doesn't explain why. The writer just assumes you'll feel the same way as him, who I guess he would feel uncomfortable being around a bunch of men at a gathering. There was not even a pretense of diversity here. So would Bond feel better if the villains were pretending like they cared about diversity? I already laughed at the disabled part, and this was unapologetically old school gathering. Again, Bond is usually facing evil scientists who are going to release a dirty bomb, but in this case, he's facing the horror of an unapologetic group of men gathering together. However, this excerpt isn't even the most egregious part of the book. As Bond arrives for the party, Higson writes he wanted to blend in, not draw attention to himself. He was Peter Sanborn, someone who was serious about his job. He just hoped to God that everyone else wasn't going to be wearing cloaks and hoods and jingling about in chainmail. I don't understand that last reference there, but upon entering the main room, Bond observes many of the men in the room could be described as ex-something, ex-military, ex-politician, ex-media pundit for hire. They'd become more and more extreme in their views and too toxic, unruly, and unsafe to remain affiliated with the radical groups they joined. When you become too far out for a far-right or far-left organization, you knew you were really on the outside. It sounds like Higson is projecting. Hickson continued, but just look at them now with their champagne and nibbles, their shiny shoes, their beaming faces. They were firmly on the inside and loving it. They'd found their tribe, and very soon they were going to announce themselves to the world. No longer outcast, no longer canceled, no longer marginalized. They were going to be the new overlords. There was only one person standing between them and chaos: James Bond. Now that last sentence doesn't make sense because it sounds like he's allied with the villains. It should say there was only one person standing between the British people and chaos, or the British people and this organization, James Bond. But continuing, as Bond made his way throughout the room, he makes further observations about who these men are. The men he talked to invariably started with what shows they'd been streaming: sport, travel, women, cars, and soon moved on to laughing about how much they hated cyclists and bus lanes and congestion charging and traffic calming, and how global warming was a con, and sooner or later came around to the big woke conspiracy, Black Lives Matter, the Great Replacement, and what are we going to do about the Muslims? Again, with these lists, Jesus Christ. And I thought it was funny when he said the men he talked to invariably started with what shows they've been streaming. Like, yeah, I can't wait to take over England. By the way, did you watch Stranger Things this weekend? Like, this sounds like a talking point written by a man who spends way too much time watching Netflix and doesn't actually spend time going outside and living a life. Still further into the novel, once Athelstan makes his entrance, he addresses the partygoers. You lot, you guys are the bloody best. The backbone of England, even though half of you aren't English at all. Now see, that's a pretty good icebreaker right there. But you know what I mean. Wherever you're from, you understand that a country, any country, if it's worth its salt, must stand for something. Many people think I'm utterly old-fashioned and out of touch, but do you know what? I couldn't care less. I believe in the idea of nationhood. A country must mean something, or what is it? Just a place of random people, a meaningless blob of diverse men and women. Oh, sorry, not allowed to call them that anymore, are we? Now, this sounds perfectly reasonable for a villain. But you lot, you haven't been bamboozled and brainwashed by all this trendy leftist Tommy rot. You are prepared to stand up for your principles. You prepare to do something, to be something, to stand and fight. You are the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. Okay, so now this part definitely sounds like those internet bros who all wear the Punisher logo and everything, and they have the, what is that thing? The Molon Labe. I don't think that's how it's actually pronounced, but you know what I'm talking about. The weekend warrior types. It goes on, but you also understand one crucial thing. The greatest enemy is not a foreign invader. It's not a Persian or a Zulu or an RG. Not sure what that is. It's the enemy among us. The greatest threat comes from those who try to undermine our great country from within, which historically is accurate. Be it a biased BBC journalist with a hidden agenda, a beardy from Islington who thinks we should all ride vegan bicycles and worship at the altar of Karl Marx, or a man in a dress who insists we call him they. I don't know what this beardy from Islington references, but I assume it's something British. Still later in his speech, Athelstan states, they've taken our history, our culture, our great legacy, and tossed it in the bin. Turned it all into a pantomime, a charade. King Charles III? Perhaps we should better call him King Charles the Woke. See, that sounds like a clickbait YouTube title. That doesn't sound like something a guy who I assume is middle-aged, he's inherited a castle, and he's influential enough to get ex-military, ex-politician, and media pundits. The idea that the word woke would even be part of his lexicon is ridiculous. Moving on, eventually Bond begins to tune out Athelstan's speech and begins to judge those in attendance. Athelstan's private army was a toxic mix. Again, this is a way overused word on the internet. Some were losers looking for validation, others were thugs who enjoyed violence and wanted justification for it. They were the descendants of all those crusaders pouring out of the West into the Holy Lands. Finally, Athelstan reveals his grand plan, which, to be honest, sounds fairly boring for a James Bond novel. And that's about it. So, I want to go back to a part up here somewhere. Okay, so this part here where it says, but just look at them now with their champagne, their nibbles, their shiny shoes, their beaming faces. They were firmly on the inside and loving it. They'd found their tribe, and soon they were going to announce themselves to the world. No longer outcast, no longer canceled, no longer marginalized. They were going to be the new overlords. Now, judged by the terminology that Charlie Higson uses here. He is writing this novel to his inside group, to his tribe, to the outcasts that are part of his internet echo chamber. Because if you look at all this terminology, all these buzzwords found throughout the article, that's the same kind of stuff you usually come upon when you end up interacting with someone who's part of a far left echo chamber on social media. So this whole thing here is just projection. He is writing about himself and his group. Don't think about what you've seen on social media. Think about real life. Your friends, your family, your coworkers, random acquaintances. How many of those people have you ever heard used any of these buzzwords, any of this terminology, any way of describing just like this weird amalgamation of all these different like far right straw men all bunched together? For me, it's nobody. Nobody uses this terminology in real life. Now, either Charlie Higson is trolling or he's a genius because he convinced this publishing company to pay him for putting out this crap that he calls a novel. Either way, I hope he is as fruitful in all his future endeavors, but this is probably the worst piece of writing I've ever read in my entire life. I'd be interested to see what was said in the emails or meetings between Ian Fleming Publications and Charlie Higson when this book was being passed back and forth. But let me know what you guys think about this topic. I know that wokeness in entertainment is a fairly common topic on YouTube. The point of me reading this article was to point out the fact that behavior that Charlie Higson attaches to the villains of this novel are in fact behavior of any online echo chamber, which he is obviously a part of. Because again, normal people don't talk like this. They just don't. Especially the idea that probably a middle-aged English nobleman has even heard the word woke is just silly. It makes this whole novel seem like a joke, and I've only seen a few passages. So what I want to know from you guys in the comment section is, genuinely, how many people in your life use this kind of terminology? And if you watch the kind of YouTube content that reflects the articles that Bounding Into Comics writes, do you ever talk about that stuff to your family or friends or coworkers? Like, do they actually understand any of this terminology, all these buzzwords? Because when I do, they don't. And that's why I said when I talk, like in my real life, people don't use that kind of language. So it's weird. And I think little by little, normal people are starting to come upon that language when they go with their family to go see a movie, or if they're reading a new comic book or a James Bond novel. So you know my opinion. Let me know yours in the comment section below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you would hit that like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell so you never miss out on a new video. Thanks for watching.